From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, I am Estefania Bravo. This is From the South. We begin in Venezuela, where a short while ago, President Nicolas Maduro announced that investigations into April 30's failed coup attempt show that the director of the Venezuelan intelligence service was working undercover for the CIA.
The man who was behind the coup is a coward and a traitor. His name is Colonel Manuel Ricardo Christopher Figuera, the former head of Sebin. He was the one who helped to stage the coup, but he did not show his face in Altamira as the coup attempt began. He was not there. He abandoned his troops. He ran away early on the 30th of April, and he is still on the run. Our investigations have confirmed that Manuel Ricardo Christopher has been working for the CIA for more than a year, and he was working undercover as the head of our intelligence service.
Maduro also took a moment to pledge his support and complete trust on the country's defense minister and other authorities.
Before the country and the world, I reaffirm my complete confidence and trust with Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez, with the President of the Supreme Court, Michael Moreno, and with the Commander of the Presidential Guard, General Hernandez Dala. They have all of my support.
Venezuela is reopening its land border with Brazil and its maritime border with the island of Aruba, but not with the other Dutch Caribbean islands. The border were closed in February when the United States and its allies tried to force so-called humanitarian aid into Venezuela.
In the case of the Caribbean islands, we have only received a commitment of respect and solidarity and joint work with the authorities of Aruba, but not with the rest of the authorities that are part of the Dutch kingdom, like Bonaire and Curaçao.
3 more Venezuelan opposition lawmakers have taken refuge in foreign embassies in Caracas. They are all being investigated for their role in last week's failed coup attempt. Our correspondent, Madeline Garcia, has the story.
The Carlota Air Base in Caracas still bears the scars of the attempted coup on April 30th.
They knocked down the fence over there. The crowd burst in. One of them started firing, and the colonel, who was standing here, was wounded.
The order: attack the base and take control of it. Violent groups managed to knock down a fence and get inside. They not only managed to burn part of a command post, there was also damage in other parts. That's why the helicopters were moved to the center of the runway to protect them. When they knocked down this fence, they came in and started shooting in this direction. There were more than 20 bullet holes in this wall from rifles and handguns, and one colonel in the National Guard was wounded right here. You can see where one bullet hit that tree. It was part of what the opposition called Operation Freedom, aimed at overthrowing President Nicolas Maduro. The Altamira junction just north of the base was a battle scene and the meeting point for all those who supported the insurrection. Here lies the evidence of the crimes allegedly committed on that day. Members of the National Assembly came and went, at least 10 of them, in plain sight of the cameras.
What's happening is what we were waiting for: support from the armed forces.
Here, President Guaidó has called on the people to take to the streets and has declared that the final phase of Operation Freedom has begun.
Others included Henry Alop, the General Secretary of Venezuela's oldest party, Democratic Action, as well as Edgar Zambrano, the Vice President of the Assembly who had taken part in the talks with the government in the Dominican Republic and who has now been arrested for his role. This video shows him with Leopoldo Lopez, who escaped from his house arrest that morning, with soldiers supporting the coup and with Juan Guaido. For the public prosecutors, all these videos are evidence in their investigation into 8 crimes that include instigating rebellion and treason. So far, the Supreme Court has evidence against 7 lawmakers that points to such crimes.
They appeared publicly on the scene to support the soldiers who had revolted to overthrow a legally elected government. They clearly violated the Constitution, openly supporting the coup, and they became themselves part of a military conspiracy, which amounts to treason.
According to the court, since they were caught in the act, there is no need for an investigation into the merits of the case, and the Constituent Assembly stripped them of their immunity.
According to Article 200 of the Constitution, in Venezuela, parliamentary immunity only protects members of the Assembly from prosecution when they are carrying out their duties as lawmakers. It doesn't protect them if they commit crimes outside those duties.
56 officers and soldiers who took part in the failed coup have been demoted and expelled from the armed forces. The United States lifted its sanctions against General Manuel Christopher Figuera, the former head of the intelligence service Sebin, for the government. That shows that the sanctions are a form of political blackmail.
The Embassy Protection Collective has no intention of leaving Venezuela's embassy in Washington, D.C., even after U.S. authorities cut power to the building. Our correspondent, Alina Duarte, is on the scene. She was joined by Ursula Rosum from Code Pink.
Hello, good afternoon. Yeah, we are here outside the Venezuelan embassy here in Washington, D.C. The Embassy Protection Collective is still inside, and during the last days we have seen a lot of harassment, detentions, and one of the persons who has been detained was Ursula, a member of Code Pink's organization. She's with us. Thank you, Ursula, for being today with us. Tell us what happened that day.
2 days ago, we were attempting to deliver some food to the Embassy Protection Collective, and we approached the building, many of us carrying fruit and vegetables, and the police had said that no one is stopping you from delivering the food, while there was probably 100 of people blocking the entrance, and one of the veterans threw a cucumber at the window, and he was tackled to the ground by the police. First he had to be taken to the hospital, then he was arrested. In the meantime, there was a Guaido supporter that was stomping my feet. I was wearing sandals that day, and I could tell he was doing it on purpose, and next thing I know, I'm in handcuffs, and I must have yelled at him or tried to push him off me, but the cops, put me in handcuffs and put me in their van for about an hour and a half, not very long, but it seemed very unfair because I was being attacked and being really disrespected, and why was I the person being detained?
And during the last days, we've seen that things are getting worse. What's the situation inside the embassy?
2 nights ago, I believe it was Wednesday evening, PEPCO, which is the DC Power Authority, came and they turned off the electricity to the building under the orders of Carlos Vecchio, who was appointed by Juan Guaido as the ambassador here. So the Secret Service told us that he had ordered the power turned off, even though we know that the power bill has been paid through the end of May by the Maduro government.
Well, a lot of people is saying that they don't know why Americans are aware of about what's the situation in Venezuela. Why it's important for you?
As a U.S. citizen, I am outraged and ashamed by the history of U.S. military intervention and support for coups just throughout history, whether it's in Iran in 1953, if you look at Honduras in 2009, Chile 73, all of these coups really lead to so much suffering and repression and violence. And if the U.S. continues to support Juan Guaido and is willing, if the Trump government is willing to back that support up with military intervention, we know that this is going to be a disaster. It could be a war the scale of the Vietnam War if you have world powers fighting a proxy war in Venezuela. And so it's up to us, who are American citizens, to stop the U.S. from repeating the mistakes of our history.
Thank you so much, Ursula.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Well, we'll be reporting on this and more for Telesur. We don't know if the Venezuelan opposition will take over the embassy with an alliance with the U.S. government. So we'll be reporting on this and more for Telesur. And back to you to the studio.
We thank Alina Duarte for that important update. Now, thousands of mothers in Mexico have taken to the streets for a day of remembrance for the over 40,000 people who remain missing due to violence. This is the 8th year in a row for the march, which started back in 2011. The mothers' main demand is that their missing loved ones be found and identified so they can be laid to rest. But they're also calling for an end to violence in Mexico.
For us as mothers of families who are looking for a missing child or family member, we basically have nothing to celebrate. We came to demand that the authorities start listening to us and get to work.
And an annual event for Mother's Day that aims to reunite separated families in Mexico and the U.S. has been canceled. This after U.S. authorities did not give permission to celebrate the event called Hugs Not Border. In the past, the event allowed families on both sides of the border to meet at the canal area between the Chihuahua state in Mexico and the U.S. state of Texas.
This is the real impact of Trump's policies at the border. The agencies that we have worked with have been inflexible. I think Trump's intransigence and the racism and xenophobia has infiltrated these agencies.
Our wish is to see a loved one. It's been years since seeing them. And then to say no. The date gets closer. You count the days and then at the last minute to cancel. It's hurtful.
The government of Mexico says foreign companies will not be given the chance to build an oil refinery in the southern state of Tabasco. Instead, the work will be led by the state.
Mexico's state oil company Pemex and the Ministry of Energy will take responsibility for building a refinery in the south of the country. It's an emblematic project for the government of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and he has ruled out tenders from 4 foreign companies.
Estaban pidiendo mucho.
They were asking too much, more than $8 billion, and taking too long. We are not going to begin any project that we can't finish in 6 years.
The president declared the tenders void and called on oil workers and experts to get involved in the project that will create more than 100,000 jobs.
The strategy is to use as much Mexican know-how as possible in the engineering, in manufacturing the equipment, and in skilled labor to maximize the local content.
Since his election campaign, López Obrador has said he wants to reduce fuel imports. Currently, Mexico imports 80% of the gasoline it uses.
The domestic demand in 2018, including gasoline, diesel and jet fuel, was 1,002,000 barrels. While production that year was 360,000 barrels, the difference was covered with imports, which jeopardizes our fuel security.
Work on Mexico's 7th refinery will begin in June and should be finished in May 2022. Private companies may still play a supporting role.
Change is that all this would be contracted for specific jobs. It is this model that's been used in the past for big projects and is common around the world.
Mexico's last new refinery was built 40 years ago. Since then, a series of neoliberal governments have concentrated on drilling for crude and exporting it. They invited foreign private capital to take over part of the industry, which at its peak accounted for 40% of Mexico's income.
We'll be back very soon. Stay with us. Welcome back. A documentary filmmaker was killed in Colombia Thursday night. The police inspector of the Arauquita municipality says several unknown armed people gunned down Mauricio Lezama in a public street. Another person was injured in the attack. Lezama was in the area making a documentary about the victims of violence. And at least 4 people have been killed in the Colombian capital after an explosion in a residential area. Another 10 people are injured due to the blast. According to local reports, the explosion took place in a factory operating in a house in which there were gunpowder and other chemicals. In Argentina, at least 6 people have been arrested in connection to Thursday's shooting of a lawmaker and a public worker. Authorities say the 2 men who shot the worker to death and left the lawmaker in critical condition were among those taken into custody. One of the suspects was caught while trying to flee the country. The other was captured in Uruguay. The motive for the shooting, which happened near Congress in Buenos Aires, is still unclear. People have taken to the streets of Honduras to demand significant changes to the country's electoral system that would prevent the re-election of President Juan Orlando Hernández.
Since the coup d'etat in 2009, the international community has made calls for Honduras to implement new legislation that would seek to prevent election fraud and irregularities. But a decade later, nothing has changed.
We need electoral reforms strong enough to give the people the assurance that they are the best chosen representatives and members of the electoral court.
Back in 2017, Hondurans went to the polls amid a string of controversies and complaints. International observers noted strong indications of election fraud, yet a partial recount still handed the win to Hernández. The opposition has accused Hernández of stealing the election. Now they want to ensure he is not re-elected.
The possibility of Juan Hernández being a candidate for the presidential elections is very high, and for that, he needs to have a strong control of public institutions, so he can have more options, since he doesn't have popular support.
The opposition has expressed little confidence in international organizations that failed to reject the alleged fraud in 2017.
In the past, I thought the OAS, the UN, would say something, but I realized all these organizations very easily bend to bribes and external influences, and they end up bending to these powerful interests.
The coalition against the dictatorship plan to take their concerns before the Supreme Electoral Court, even though they have little confidence in the judicial system.
We have come forward with information, but the Attorney General's office is everything but reliable and trustworthy. It does not stand in defense of the people of Honduras. We know it's supposed to do just that, but it seems to only defend its own interests, that is, people directly linked to the state.
Many Hondurans do not want to see Hernández re-elected. It is still not an option. What they're seeking is electoral reform to stop that from happening.
A 5-year, multi-million-dollar water improvement project has been launched in Barbados to ease chronic water woes. The $45 million initiative is being implemented by the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center and the Green Climate Fund. The project is the fund's first single-country investment in the Caribbean. Once complete, it should improve access to potable water and increase Barbados' resilience to extreme climate events. Trinidad and Tobago's government is denying accusations of discrimination and inequalities in water distribution by its state-owned water authority, WASA. Residents of rural districts in the south have complained of having no water in their taps for more than 50 days. And part of the problem are long delays in repairs to pipelines in certain communities.
There's also been a lot of conversations about discrimination and where water is going and so forth. Again, that is not so. I want to say that the amount of water that WASA has plans and that they have been dealing with this situation. At present, about 88 million gallons of water per day is sent to South Trinidad, and around 89 million gallons of water a day is sent to North Trinidad. And we do, because of our aging infrastructure, we have been dealing with the challenges and the lack of focus that has been placed in certain areas when we had money vis-a-vis storage. Our storage capacity in Trinidad and Tobago is very low.
Antigua's government has expressed doubt about whether a reduction in the cost of regional air travel is achievable. Inter-island airfares have skyrocketed in the last 2 decades, but the Prime Minister's chief of staff says he believes the charges are somewhat justifiable as regional governments have invested in airport infrastructure and security, especially since 9/11. And it's unlikely government will be willing to reduce operation cost. Meanwhile, the cabinet has discussed reducing landing fees and some of the taxes Antigua-based airline Liat pays in order to keep the regional career afloat. In Algeria, tens of thousands of protesters gathered in the capital Algiers for a 12th successive Friday to demand that allies of ousted President Abdelaziz Bouteflika step down. The demonstrators have vowed to keep up the pressure, particularly on Army Chief Ahmed Gaid Salah. They blocked roads around the capital's main post office square, the epicenter of the protest movement, which was launched in February.
Our demand is that the gang leaves. We don't want elections until the gang is gone, because these people are the ones who used to support Bouteflika and gather signatures for him. They are liars and thieves, and we don't trust them.
Moving on, with about 99% of votes declared, it is now clear that South African voters have given the ruling African National Congress a new mandate to lead the country for the next 5 years. Latest results show that the ANC has won 57.6% of the ballots, while the opposition Democratic Alliance stands at 20.6%, a 2% decline from the 2014 elections. Meanwhile, the Economic Freedom Fighters stands at 10.5%. And the Independent Electoral Commission of South Africa will conduct an audit of the results of Wednesday's elections. Addressing a media conference after meeting with representatives of political parties, Chief Electoral Officer Sai Mamabolo assured that concerns raised by all parties will be addressed during the audit. A group of 35 parties has threatened to launch a legal challenge against the results announced by the Commission.
Good afternoon. The Electoral Commission will urgently conduct an audit of results and votes cast in a sample of voting stations to ascertain if double voting occurred. The audit will cover a statistically representative sample of voting stations, as well as where complaints and allegations of double voting have been received.
At least 50 people have died in Tunisia after a boat capsized off the coast of Kerkena. 16 people have been rescued by fishing boats. The number of victims is expected to rise as the recovery bodies by the Tunisian Navy is still ongoing. The victims, who are of sub-Saharan origin, had sailed off from Libya. Misrata-based armed groups are heading to the Libyan capital Tripoli to join fighters loyal to the UN-backed government to fend off an attack by General Khalifa Haftar's forces. Haftar's so-called Libyan National Army, or LNA, which is allied to a rival administration in eastern Libya, mounted an offensive on Tripoli in April. They claim that the UN-backed government is controlled by terrorists. The fighting has killed hundreds of people and displaced thousands. We'll be back very soon. Stay with us. Welcome back. In the United Kingdom, supporters of the Venezuelan government held a protest outside the offices of The Guardian newspaper in London. Organizers say that they held the demonstration to speak out against the lies and imperialist propaganda being spread by the newspaper and other media outlets. Protesters accused the mainstream media of spreading misinformation to bolster public opinion for an illegal coup in Venezuela.
It is doing propaganda.
The final day of trade talks between China and the U.S. ended with the U.S. increasing tariffs on Chinese products. The U.S. has raised tariffs on close to $300 billion worth of Chinese imports. China says it deeply regrets the move and will take necessary countermeasures. Venezuela will likely be up for discussion when Russian President Vladimir Putin and U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo meet in Russia next week. It's one of the issues the U.S. and Russia have clashed over, with Pompeo having led Washington's calls for Russia to stop backing Venezuela's legitimate president, Nicolas Maduro. This is perhaps the most significant interaction between the two countries since last July, when U.S. President Donald Trump met President Putin in Finland. Demonstrators in Iran have rallied in support of the government's plan to no longer implement some parts of the nuclear deal. The protesters have denounced the United States' withdrawal from the deal and the reinstatement of unilateral economic sanctions. On Wednesdays, Iran's president gave the U.S. a 60-day ultimatum, or it will quit parts of the 2015 nuclear agreement.
We are here today following the order of our leader and for the glory of our nation, for the destruction of our enemies and of the authorities of France and America, and of the imperialists of the world, and the damned people who have risen against Shiites and Muslims and the oppressed of the world.
The United Nations Refugee Agency says a record 41.3 million people were uprooted within their own countries last year due to conflicts and violence. 2/3 were displaced in just 10 countries, including Syria, Colombia, and Somalia. Unlike refugees or asylum seekers, internally displaced people cannot claim international protection and often have less access to aid and medical care. And with that story, we've come to the end of this news brief. These and other stories, as always, find them on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also join us on social media. We are on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram. For Telesur English, I am Estefania Bravo. Thank you for watching.